Well, hello and welcome to LabYak, where we interview the world's leading scientists and engineers and ask them what gets them excited about what they're working in. And today I'm absolutely delighted to have Dr. Ranna Eardley-Patel with me. Ranna is the Sustainable Manufacturing Lead for the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, that is CEPI to you and me. And Ranna, welcome to LabYak.
Thank you, Steve. Lovely to see you again, and thanks for inviting me to take part in this series.
You've been working for the last 4 or 5 years, Ranna, on vaccines, very, very closely. You and I worked together on the vaccine task force that the UK government put together. And I wondered how someone in your place today, how did it all begin? Did you always want to be an engineer when you were a little girl?
No. Do you know what you want to be? You do when you're 4 or 5. You know, then you're very shaped by your teachers and your parents and what you know. And I thought I wanted to be a scientist. I always liked that, but I was really good at the arts as well, and I really enjoyed languages and travel. And I grew up in a traditional Asian family, and you know, there's certain careers that, you know, that were thought of as stable and that were a good thing to aim for. And I was allowed to stay up to watch Casualty, but I hated it. I really couldn't stand the trauma, but I liked the excitement. And then so I was really lucky. I went to a really great school in the centre of Birmingham, and we came from all over Birmingham, and it was a selective school. It was a grammar school. So we got, you know, we had some opportunities for local companies, and I got involved in something called the Engineering Education Scheme, which was run by the Royal Academy of Engineering. They came into our school and did a talk and said, there's this thing called engineering, which means that you can do art and science at the same time. And I went, yes, that's probably for me. So I did a project during my A-levels. I did a City and Guilds alongside, because I knew I wanted to do that. I thought I wanted to do an apprenticeship, but in those days, it wasn't something that was going to happen for a girl. But that's why they came into my school. They realised that had to change, and it's just fantastic to see that it has changed with the fantastic and high calibre apprenticeship schemes we have in the UK now. So I went on and studied chemical engineering. I stayed on the Royal Academy, supported me all the way through, and I got scholarships and grants and training for them to stay in engineering, because it's very easy to leave engineering. It's a hard course. I worked in fast-moving consumer goods, so I made fairy liquid and washing powder for a while. Wow. Yeah. And then I realised, actually, I do have a passion for healthcare. And so I switched and did graduate studies. I went and did an engineering doctorate, and that was a new scheme again, to do a PhD in biochemical engineering alongside business modules, and a more of a portfolio type doctoral studies, and that's what the engineering doctorate is. And the NGD centres have now been going on for about 20 years, and they're an established programme and recognised as on par with some of the European PhDs, because they're of a similar length. So I worked part-time with a company called Millipore in filtration, and then I did my studies at the same time, and I got paid, so I got to leave university debt-free, which was fantastic, and then I have never looked back.
Fantastic, fantastic. And how do so you're armed with an engineering doctorate, which is a relatively new qualification in what you were in as a UK individual anyway. How did you choose what to do next? Well,
it's about opportunity, isn't it? Did I choose it? It happened. I graduated in a recession, and it was really hard to get a job. I was overqualified for some things, but in engineering terms, I had no experience, and that's what I really love about engineering. I work for people, they're my boss, that didn't get an A-level. They worked their way up, and they know what they're doing, and they've got experience. And I work with people who've got multiple degrees and who are the cleverest people you'll ever meet. And engineering is about bringing all of those people together, the scientists, the business people, the marketing people, to harness the great discovery in that technology and bring it to where it's needed. And I think Britain is particularly good at doing that.
Well, that's a great advert for engineering. And as you got into that and you worked with all these people, and obviously you've learned from the people you've worked with, and your career sort of goes through a number of phases, doesn't it? As you went through, as you sort of left university and went to your first, and then your second, and your third, you sort of end up 10 years later on the edge of where you are now. In that 10 years, did you consciously move yourself towards where you are now, or did you how does that work in your career planning?
Well, I did. I consciously moved it because I had this training from the Royal Academy of Engineering Scheme, and they made us do a 1, 5, 10-year plan. We thought it was, I'm not going to use bad words, like why, okay, what the point, but let's just play the game. Actually, it's about visualization. It's about, then you recognize those opportunities that are going to get you to where you're going to go, and those opportunities that may not, but they might be stepping stones. And that was really important. And it was a big thing, you know. I'm very passionate about women in engineering. And I see that with women I employ, and I see the modern way of working. When I entered the workforce, you were expected to join a company and stay in that company for the duration. That's what my parents knew. That's what my teachers knew. And I joined a company and I just thought, I don't think I can work for this multinational for the rest of my life. How's that going to work if I want children? How's that going to work when I get married? And my husband earns more than I do, so therefore he's going to dictate where we live. I can't just up sticks and leaves and go and work in South America for the rest of our lives, which I did. You know, I did it for a period of time and I had a great time, but I had to balance that. And actually I realized it's not a woman-only problem, it's all of us. We don't get told that at school. No one told me at school, you know what, you might have to balance your work life with taking care of elderly parents or children. And I think we're getting better at that now. So, you know, I went off in my 20s, thought I could take over the world, traveled. I've worked on every single continent, bar Antarctica and the Arctic. I've done engineering capital projects, I've done research, I've lived with tribes in the Amazon and the Masai Mara, really got the most of my life, and I did it all, I was paid for it all because that's what I wanted to do. And I knew I had this mission in my life, which was to bring that healthcare to the masses. I didn't really know how I was going to do it, but that was my overarching vision. And I asked that question to myself every time I take on a new role. Is that going to help me achieve that mission? And if the answer is yes, then I go for it.
Brilliant. And so when I mean, what a great story of a mission-led career. And just as you get into the last decade, so it was 2017, 2018, you found yourself, I think, working in areas where you were starting to get really close to the front line in terms of some of the things you've been talking about. And then in 2020, you end up in the Vaccine Task Force. Can you talk a little bit about how did you end up, and this is the UK government's Vaccine Task Force, perhaps tell us a little bit about that period of time and how did you end up basically working on vaccines for COVID-19?
Well, I'd previously worked on vaccines, not by choice. I just happened to work for an engineering firm, which was called CEL at the time in Birmingham, and they became WSP. And I did a project for flu vaccines and H5N1 up in Liverpool and Speke. And so it's a new facility, and that's really where I cut my teeth in engineering, design, and commissioning and validation. So I had a track record in vaccines. At some point, I left a nice job I was in because I wanted to go traveling again. And I worked in Holland for a while. I worked in the Netherlands. And I worked on a polio facility, which was fantastic. A new experience for me because it's high containment and something my father had worked on. So there was a bit of a legacy piece there to bring the stuff that he had worked in the 60s to fruition, and I could carry on and bring that. And the mission there was polio eradication. So my job there was to do tech transfer between Dutch, Indian and Czech facilities so we could make enough vaccine to really push for that eradication of polio. And we achieved that in Africa during my time there. Then I was doing various bits and pieces. I was working in gene and cell therapy, which is very allied, actually, in biotech. And the pandemic struck. And I volunteered for ISPE at that time, and IChemE through my mentoring work. So we all got together. It's like, we ought to do something. What can we do? So we phoned each other and said, who's doing this? Do you need support? And I phoned an old colleague of mine called Mark Proctor, who worked for AstraZeneca.
Right.
And he said, we're setting this up. We don't know what we're doing. We're not a vaccines person. Do you know anyone? And I went, yeah. I know a few people and I'm one of them. So what can we do? So I ended up working for AstraZeneca.
Wow.
And they said, okay, we're just going to get some consultants in because who've got vaccines experience to help us shepherd this. We've got some very specialist facilities. We're learning, we're building this plane as we're flying it. Just be aware of that. And we sat in our bedrooms and we did something amazing.
Yeah.
If anybody had told me at the start of the pandemic that we'd get a vaccine out in less than a year, I would have laughed. I would have laughed outright, fallen off my chair, and then I would have generally put my hands together and go, I think you don't really understand the way that we can do this. But suddenly the world had changed, we had changed, and we were creative as a result.
Yeah.
We pushed and challenged ourselves and our boundaries and each other, and my teams were the first. I was really proud of that. The Dutch and the British teams were the first to manufacture batches. We weren't supposed to be the first. All the effort had been put into other facilities, but my teams are fantastic, and Oxford Biomedica pulled it out of the bag that what these people did.
Yeah. And was that the key, Ranna? Was it? I mean, because it sounds, you've talked about creativity, you've talked about just the unbelievable commitment, really, that everybody had. But, you know, all of us in the summer of 2020 were trying to manage people's expectations that it was going to take, you know, traditionally it took 8 years to do stuff like this. And here we are trying to do something in 8 months. What can you put your finger on it? I mean, what was it? What was the magic?
We were fighting a war. We were fighting a war against the smallest known enemy, as to quote Bill Gates, and it was affecting us personally. And we could see it in the public way, and I think the British government, I mean, lots of governments did it, and it's like protect the NHS.
Yeah.
And this is something what's my mission now, and this is why I've got into CEPI, is that we weren't frontline workers. The people who went out and made those vaccines or tested those vaccines weren't frontline workers, but they were the ones that were going to get us out of this in terms of vaccines. And I believe that from my experience in vaccines, that vaccines is an essential part of that portfolio for public health security, for protection. You need vaccines, you need the treatments, the antivirals, you need the healthcare, you need the public health measures, but there's a portfolio of things to win a war. And we were part of that. And I guess one thing that my experience of my international travels had brought me is that cultural understanding. So we were trying to communicate with the Japanese and the Koreans and the Americans and the English and the Dutch all at the same time. It was uncertain, there was risk. These people were scared for their own lives, let alone their families' lives. And you have to put that into context. You have to say, do you know what, mistakes are going to happen. And they did. We'll move past that. We'll just keep moving forwards. We'll just keep moving forwards. Hurdle will come. Okay, let's just not throw our hands up in the air going, oh, we can't do that. That's what we would have done. We would have been ultra conservative and say, we can't take that risk because we're making biologics. We were really pragmatic about it. And there's some really, really smart people. And this is where I feel that engineers come in, because we're quite pragmatic. We have a broader view, we have a holistic view, and yet we make an effort. I have to make an effort every day to understand the deep science and the facts and the data, which clever scientists explain to me. And then I look at that and I'll evaluate the risk of that and say, okay, this risk is acceptable, or no, we don't think this risk is acceptable. We start the batch again, or I think we should try and release this material, because if we do release this material and it's good, we save hundreds of lives, thousands of lives.
Yeah.
And then the real magic happened is we'd already established these international relationships, and therefore COVAX was born, and that's why I joined CEPI. CEPI was a founding member of COVAX, and it continued my work within the UK Vaccines Task Force and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. So not many people know this, but the UK was also responsible for not only rolling out vaccines in the UK and Northern Ireland, but also its overseas territories. And I had no idea where UK's overseas territories were until someone said, Ranna, how are we going to get these vaccines out to Tierra del Fuego? I went, that's a long way away. So we had to work with the military. We had to work with frontline care workers because they had to administer it. We had to work with cold chain logistics specialists. All these things that I had never thought of to get the projects that my teams had made 6 months ago out to the people that needed it. And that was the end piece for me.
That's a great piece of the story, actually, in terms of some of the inner workings, if you like, of what happened in 2021 as the rollout started to happen. And you've talked about the role of engineers. One of the interesting things I think that I know you had to deal with was not only the outgoing, the outward-looking pieces that you've just talked about, where you're looking at how you deploy things, but also explaining internally within government how it works. Can you share a little bit about your role in terms of trying to explain to people who are very not scientists, but are actually the people who are making the decisions and who are potentially funding the work that was going on through the task force work?
Yeah, exactly. And it's just the UK Vaccines Task Force, and I've looked at different task forces in my current role, did particularly well because very early on it had people like you and Clive Dix, have come from an engineering and science background and brought in specialists, so we had people who could talk about the hard engineering and the science, and we had people like me who were supposed to be the communicators to explain things. I like to use analogies. I use Bake Off quite a lot as an analogy. You can give people the same materials, and this is what happened during the AstraZeneca thing. You give them exactly the same ingredients, detailed instructions on the process, but whether they made a good vaccine or cake really depended on the skill of those people and lots of other factors, like the temperature in the tent or the clean room.
Exactly.
And then people then got it. And then they could shape that into policy. And then if we're funding things and if we're using public money to do things, you need some assurance of, are we doing a good thing here? Are we not? The game had changed. We were losing a huge amount of money, and psychologically the damage that was being done by being in lockdown, we had that to play with in context. So normal civil service rules and procurement rules had to be treated in that lens. We couldn't shortcut anything, and this is the same. Don't shortcut anything, but be pragmatic, and that's what we managed to do together. I really believe that.
So, rolling the clock forward, you're now sustainable manufacturing lead. Can you talk a little bit about where's that going? What does sustainable manufacturing mean in terms of pandemic innovation?
Yeah, and I just thought, what's his job title? And I'm really passionate about engineering, and I'm really passionate about sustainable design, green energy, nothing to do with that at all. Within the CEPI context, it's about operational sustainability.
Right.
What we learned during the pandemic flu season is that, and COVID-19, is that distribution of vaccine didn't happen. COVID-19 and influenza are both global pandemics, and everybody needs to be vaccinated. Everybody needs to be vaccinated for us to be safe, because we live in a global economy. We travel. We can't stop people moving now. This is how things spread. So recognizing that, I thought, well, let's bring some of that knowledge into an organization like CEPI, which is primarily started as an R&D organization. So they are a catalytic funder of innovations and new things. They stepped up during the pandemic like everybody else, established COVAX, got out their territory, and we're a very small organization, but they're agile, and they're unique. They're not an NGO per se, but they're not totally philanthropic. They are government funded as well and privately funded. So it's an interesting mix, but it was born out of the World Economic Forum at Davos. We're majority funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the Wellcome Foundation, and governments give us money to do particular things for their countries, but in the recognition that global pandemic preparedness needs to be happening. So sustainability means we need to build capacity that's globally distributed, and once that's been built, it needs to be sustained.
Yes.
There's no point chucking a whole load of money, building vaccine manufacturing facilities in 20 million places and then letting them fail. And that's actually quite a complicated thing, because it's a specialist thing that we do. You need to keep the people engaged. You know, in my career, I worked in engineering, design and capital projects. There's not a lot of those at the moment in the UK. I had to leave it because there wasn't enough work for me. And I wasn't free to go and be in whatever country that I needed to be, and that was a personal choice. But we need that sustainability. We need to go, well, okay, so they can make vaccines. Well, what else can they make?
Right.
Let's you know, or let's have a minimum. Let's gear them up so they don't just make just mRNA vaccines, that they can make biologic vaccines. So therefore, they can do a portfolio to serve the country or the region that they're in.
Right.
So when the COVID-19 pandemic ended, every country said, right, we want vaccine facilities now. Suddenly the politicians go, let's have a vaccine facility. And it's like, well, have you got any kind of biologics facility? Have you got universities that train for these things? No. Then you've got a while to go.
Yes.
Now, no problem you going for that, but how about nearshoring instead of onshoring? Right.
Yeah, that's a good phrase. And do you see?
Yeah.
Do you see that if you look at the next 5 years, is that a nearshoring? I like that phrase. Do you see that as being part of sustainability then going forward? The next the preparation for the next health emergency will involve more distributed manufacture than we had in 2020.
You know, the secret is that manufacturing has always been distributed. There's no facility that cannot work without importing or exporting anything, because all our raw materials are global, all the minerals, the media, the plastics, the single-use technology, the stainless steel, it's all international. It always has been. We just don't recognize it because it's very specialist and niche, and few people know about it. The general public don't.
Yeah.
So one of the things we did in the vaccine task force is to look at the export and import codes and move that free movement of goods. And logistics is a very key part of moving vaccines around, as well as to make them and to get them out again.
So what are you most hopeful about in your current role that we as a global team will achieve in the next 5 years in terms of readiness for the next health emergency, whatever it might be?
I'm really hopeful that it's been brought onto the agenda again with this pandemic, that there are a team of people who have got real life experience and that can bring that into the game. I'm going to quote Patrick Vallance here. He was just saying there were plenty of people giving me advice what to do during the pandemic, but not many people really wanted to listen to the people who'd had experience already. And I think that's changed after COVID-19. Actually, we are starting to have a conversation, which is not just talking at, it's about listening to all of the different parts of the puzzle and viewing that public health is part of public health security. We recognise that in the UK. We've always had a health security agency, and that's got prominence in the UK government. We've installed a new minister, George Freeman, for science and technology. It's saying it's not just science, it's not just environment. All of these things are matrix. All of these things are now interlinked. Digital technology is going to revolutionise what we're doing in every walk of life, including what we do in vaccines and healthcare. Let's do that. Let's get the vaccines people talking to the gene and cell therapy people, because actually we've been discussing that in CEPI, saying, you know what, this mRNA vaccines needing ultra cold storage, not a great idea for sub-Saharan Africa. And then somebody reminded me of the Coca-Cola story, which is somebody, an epidemiologist, figured out that vaccine uptake in Africa was skyrocketing. It was doing really, really well. And they worked out the reason was, well, there's a direct correlation between where Coca-Cola was doing marketing and pushing Coca-Cola in. Now, that particular fizzy drink tastes better cold. So they sold fridges. They put fridges in as part of their marketing campaign. And the clever health workers go, oh, I've got these fridges now. I can store these vaccines in.
Brilliant.
So vaccines were getting to the last mile. And now we're thinking, do you know what? The mRNA vaccine producers put freezers out, and we had the cold chain just to get their vaccines out. Then it opens it for also other mRNA products for cancer treatment, stem and cell and gene therapies. It's going to be serendipitous. Isn't that a great thing to happen for our healthcare systems?
No, that's a great story. Thank you. Just thinking about all you've told me, Ranna, how does someone in your position, how do you unwind from all of this? You're clearly very passionate about the world that you work in, but how do you unwind when you're not doing what you do 9 to 5?
Don't do 9 to 5. That's a tricky one. You know I'm really privileged. I've got a great family, and I have great hobbies. I'm a gardener. I have a heritage orchard that I co-own in Hampshire with my neighbours, and that grounds me. And I think it's really important. Something that I share with my mentees now, that was shared with me, is that it's like life is like an elastic band. We're like elastic bands. We can stretch, but you only stretch to your full potential if you're anchored in one position, if something holds you. So I have that to hold me, and then I can stretch. And I know when I'm stretching too much and I need to just go and unwind, and I take time for myself, and I realize I need to look after myself first before I can truly look after anybody else. And I think that's the feedback I had from my teams during that COVID-19 pandemic. And I get that. It's like, you looked after us, Ranna. That's why you were different. And I go, well, I didn't do anything different that I normally do, but yeah, let's all do that. I respect you because you always looked after me. You always checked, are you okay? Is this comfortable? And I'll be totally honest and direct, and with my team, saying, I think this is risky, and we'd talk about it and we'd do it together. And I think that's really important when you're dealing with the unknown.
Great. Well, Ranna, it's been great hearing your story, and thank you for being so open and for sharing with us. And so really a big thank you. Thanks for being on LabYak.
You're welcome. Thank you very much, Steve. I hope to listen to more of the stories as the series develops. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.